All right, so this second part is going to be examples of halakha from this time period, or the first century or second temple period. So the rabbis get their biblical authority from Exodus and Deuteronomy, as we've talked about in previous episodes. That enables them to teach, educate, and judge matters of society that relate to the Torah and its commandments. So the sages practice in their role using many different tools to achieve something called the spirit of what the Torah requires, using the letter of the law to make it something that is an established code of living for all members of society. So the sages have two major ways in which they can fulfill this role. They can enact something for the people called tekhanot in Hebrew, or place a protective fence around the Torah to reduce people transgressing a command in the Torah called gezerot. So there's two ways that they could enforce and produce biblical law. And these were guided by something called hermeneutical tools, which is really just ways of looking at the Bible and interpreting it by a set standard of tools and questions and analysis. So they would learn these, and that would be part of how they would develop these parts of Jewish society. And they were grounded, or they were after the same spirit and voice as the actual written Torah. So really, halakha is just taking what's in the way the written Torah is and expounding it orally into a different part of society, or going beyond the examples given in the Torah. So going beyond the bounds of the letter, finding the spirit of the Torah, enables the sages to rule in a way that kind of meets these social demands, the part where we look after people in terms of poor or widows or orphans, or we look at people's humanity more than we do look at something that is a black and white legal decision. Even though these are technically legal decisions, they're not legalistic in the way we think of legalism as in modern lawyers or modern law codes. The Torah has way more scope to it, way more life to it, because it blends a personal life with a national life, with the way you treat your fellow with how you relate to God, kind of merge into one, and yet have some separate dimensions. But they all come back to the fact that you do this because you love God. So going beyond the bounds of the letter enables the sages to rule by the spirit of the Torah as a legal reality. And within the bounds of the Torah enables the sages to keep the letter, and when necessary, to restrict the power of those who are in danger of abusing their power over others. So a lot of this stuff was actually about protecting the Torah from abuse, or being abused or used to abuse others as a weapon or a means of holding power over a minority that couldn't advocate for themselves, as we saw that the Hellenized priests were starting to do. So there's this idea in the Torah called light and heavy, right? And that refers to lightening the burden of a commandment in the Torah, or making it weightier, placing more emphasis on one part of it. And this is usually used in an ethical sense, not so much in a way that's talking purely legalistic, but it usually brings emphasis to what the heart of the Torah is saying. So the sages often looked at the needs of the community and took into account the poor and the needy and the unfavorable in society. And they developed things like credit systems by which the poor could buy food on festivals and kind of do things which, if they followed the strict letter of the Torah, that they couldn't do. But by following the strict letter of the Torah, people would have come to harm. So what they would do is rule on the light side, which is still within the realms of Torah, but they were meeting people's needs by doing so, or bringing out the spirit of what the Torah wanted, really. Things like saving a life can override the sanctity of the Sabbath and the sacrificial system, or changing a certain Torah sanctioned burial practice to make it easier on the poor because they didn't have the funds needed to do this type of religious burial. So they were always thinking about how the Torah can better serve those who are least able to engage with the Torah. And so they often looked at people who were on the fringes of society in their time. For instance, the sages took special care to improve the safety and welfare and engagement of women in society by enabling them to divorce if they were trapped in abusive marriages, or trying to improve their economic status. And they often use a method of interpretation in which they interpret a Bible verse to override in one part of the context in light of a different verse, thus providing a different way of seeing the text. And usually that, again, enables the spirit of the Torah to come out. So one part of the Torah is, and we're going to put quotes, cancelled, so that another part can be interpreted to uphold what the spirit of the Torah is actually wanting us to do, thus providing a way to see how this verse can meet the demands of humanity and the demands of God's spirit in the Torah without actually nullifying it. And these are methods that both Yeshua and the rabbis used to keep the spirit of the Torah alive and enable its observance to continue, even amongst the most hardest economic times or persecutions from overlords like the Greeks and the Romans. So often when it comes to Yeshua and we talk about the spirit versus the letter, we often think of Yeshua as kind of, he's not into the whole legal side of looking at Jewish law, but in reality, he's probably one of the most brilliant minds of his time, in that he knows how to use both the spirit and the letter to actually create rulings that met the demands of where people were at, using the same system as we've discovered in both the Torah and the Talmud. And we're going to continue to develop this theme throughout this podcast series. However, though, we often come to these kind of roadblocks in our understanding just due to a lack of education or understanding of what Jewish law is, or a flawed interpretation in the past. So halakha is often seen as like this kind of rigid, unyielding, kind of cold, heartless, unethical system. However, this is actually the furthest from the truth. And often when we see it practiced like that in Judaism, it's because the people who practice it have kind of lost touch with how the system balances out, or as we might have said once in growing up in Christianity, lost touch with the spirit of the Torah, which is a legal term in itself. But walking by the spirit can actually be quite a legal thing, which is part of the beautiful dynamics of the word of God. So if we were to ask Yeshua, like, what's the greatest command in the Torah, right? Love your neighbor is one of the ones that comes up all the time. And apparently upon this, the whole Torah hangs. But then we have to ask the question, is this a metaphor? Is this real? How can the whole Torah hang on the command of love your neighbor, or as it's often referred to, the love command? Well, we're going to look at some examples of how this becomes a reality. So the teachings of Jesus, or Yeshua, such as the Sermon on the Mount, have been called the antithesis to Judaism. So the complete opposite, apparently. When we've read it in the past, growing up, it's always been, Jesus is saying, I'm teaching you something that is totally the opposite to how Jews used to live. When in contextual reality, it's the complete opposite. He's actually showing us how we can be more Jewish by following his commands. So for instance, this love command of love your neighbor has said to be opposed to legalistic dead works that we often find in the Jewish way of worshiping God. It's actually a concept that Judaism is really familiar with and has actually worked into a lot of its oral teachings and great literary works of both before the time of Yeshua and after. We're just not familiar with the idea of it being a part of Judaism. It is true, however, that on the Sermon on the Mount, it highlights certain teachings that were opposite to the nature of Judaism and to Yeshua at the time. But are these the teachings of rabbinic Judaism, or are they the teachings of a different type of Judaism? That's the question we really have to ask. We often assume, well, he's teaching against the system, or is he safeguarding the system? That's something we're going to start looking at in this podcast as well. He's often been seen as the warrior against the establishment, trying to bring down the religious leaders and show them up as all hypocrites, to bring out this new revolutionary system called Christianity. But what if he was actually trying to fight the war from within? What if he was fighting on the side of the common religious establishment against a foreign invader? What if he was part of not a revolution, but a civil war that was happening at the time? What if the all you have heard it said, but I say unto you, was not shots fired at the establishment, but barriers to protect it from an enemy within? We're going to attempt to answer that in just a minute. So, why does love your neighbor carry such weight in the New Testament? And what do the rabbis give value to on this command? So, in light of all this, how does love your neighbor uphold the whole Torah? It's still a burning question. On a logical level, you could say it doesn't really make sense. If you look at all the laws of the Torah, if you've ever read what is often called the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, you probably go, it's not really doable. It doesn't really make sense. Well, this is where halakha, or Jewish law, actually comes in. So how can this uphold the spirit of the Torah, right? So the greatest command we see in Matthew 22, 34 to 41. Torah does not tell us which command is actually the greatest. So in Matthew 22, when Yeshua is approached by these Torah scholars, there's this already underlining assumption that loving your neighbor is the greatest command. However, the Torah doesn't say, do this because it's the greatest command. It just appears in a list of other commands. And somehow, through a tradition, it's become the one that is the greatest, but through no description of the Torah itself. It doesn't even tell us which one is last. It really doesn't tell us much about the order of commandments. So even the idea that God is one, there's no evidence in the Torah that this command is equal to all of them, or love your neighbor is equal to all of them, or weightier than all of them. This is the work of the prophets and the sages. Yeshua is perpetuating the prophet's call to humanitarian need in service of God. So this is already a tradition. When we talk about extra biblical tradition, we're talking about love your neighbor, and that loving your neighbor fulfills the whole Torah. That's an extra biblical idea. And this is kind of, I guess, encapsulated by Hosea 6:4, that I desire kindness, not sacrifice. That kind of starts to come out not in the commands of the Torah, but in the prophets. And as we said, the prophets handed over the torch, if you will, to the sages and the rabbis. So in a book that is often thought of as just purely ethical, called Pirkei Avot, or Sayings or Ethics of the Fathers, I would argue it's actually essential to the Jewish legal process or halakhic process, because it's all about the spirit elements. So if we look at chapter 2 of Ethics of the Fathers, verse 1, it tells us this: be anxious with a light matter as with a heavy one. Even Yeshua talks about teaching the least of the commandments, and that will make us the least, or teaching people to follow the commandments will make us greater. So already you can see that from the Ethics of the Fathers, there's an idea of one way of following Torah being greater than the other, or teaching people to follow Torah with that mindset makes you greater in the kingdom. Again, this doesn't appear anywhere in Torah. This is all purely outside the Torah. It's not even in the prophets. And then Rabbinic Judaism saw Deuteronomy 6:4, known in Judaism as the Shema prayer, as the greatest command of loving God and loving man. And these are essential to how we have a spirit-led or spirit-filled halakha, or legal walking out as a community of the word of God. So we often hear of this group who come to antagonize Yeshua, called the Pharisees, or in Hebrew, Perushim. But really, these guys are that group outside, because in Hebrew, a Perush means a separate one. So these are actually separatists, meaning they're separate from something that is already established, not the mainstream. And they believed that the idea that love your neighbor or Shema Israel, hear Israel, these weren't commands that had any specific weight. They weren't considered to be weightier. They were equal with all the other commandments, which, as we've just seen, is not what the sages and Yeshua have said. These guys were in association with groups that you may have heard of called the Qumran sect or the Dead Sea Scroll writers. Those guys were a group of separatist zealots who lived a totally different way of Torah to their neighbors in Israel. For them, the love your neighbor and keep the Sabbath were all on equal footing. However, for the sages, we know this clearly was not the case. There were some commandments that clearly had weight, and you could, in a certain situation, you should choose them over others because of the weight they carried. In a certain legal work called Sifrei Devarim, or it's a commentary on Deuteronomy, in chapter 32, verse 29, it says this: if they were wise, they would understand this. If Israel looked into the words of Torah, the nation could dominate them. And what did I say to them? Take upon yourselves the yoke of the kingdom of heaven and strengthen each other in fear of heaven and treat each other with loving kindness. That's another practical example of how this is the yoke, the weight of the Torah, the kingdom, the taking it up is in loving kindness towards your fellow. Keep in mind that this work was only written down in the 12th century, but the oral content existed from the Maccabean period, or 165 before Common Era onwards. So this is part of what is considered a totally legal work. It's not necessarily an ethical work, this Sifrei Devarim. It's purely legal process. But as we've seen, ethics is part of legal thought and doctrine and analysis. That spirit can't be separated from it, or else it would die. And this ethic reflects the concept of the Sermon on the Mount. Loving your neighbors is a legal action in Judaism, one that is of the spirit, not necessarily the letter. And then we're going to find another classic work of Jewish law or halacha called Megillah de Rabbanan Ishmael, and it's based on Exodus 18:20. And it informs us that the Torah teaches us the way we should go and the deeds we should do. And this legal midrash or exegetical sermon or discussion discusses that when the Torah speaks of deeds we should do, it refers to going beyond the letter of the law. And the way we should walk refers to the deeds done to the letter of the law. So famous rabbis such as Yosef ben Yoza of the Hashmonaim period or the Maccabean period was known to rule leniently and thus revised old teachings on things like ritual purity to establish less strict ones, in line with that Megillah de Rabbanan Ishmael we've just looked at, for example. So this is what this famous Rabbi Yosef ben Yoza, a man from Sereda, would testify concerning liquids in the slaughterhouse or of the temple, saying that it was pure and that one who touches a corpse is impure, and they would call him Yosef the Permitter. In other words, he was saying, I guess, counterculture to what had been done before. I'm going to permit things that were otherwise not permitted before. And he's never really given a reason why. He just did it because it was the spirit of the law and it was needed at the time. So this rabbi revised purity laws found in Numbers 19:16, where if a person dies in the same room as a corpse, they absorb their impurity, thus they become tamei or ritually impure. So Rabbi Yosef has revised that halakha from the Torah and thus changed it to one so that one who comes into contact with him does not take on this impure state. In the same manner that Yeshua tells us, we have heard it said, but I say unto you, other rabbis have made amendments and changed the boundaries of halakha, and yet there appears to be no controversy for their actions. This is the work Yeshua is doing in the Sermon on the Mount, helping us fulfill Torah by giving us a new way to follow Torah, by changing boundaries, by moving with the times, by letting the spirit of the Torah lead how we legally write that ink of the letter to uphold the spirit and encapsulate it. A famous rabbi called Rabbi Hillel did something similar. He instituted something called prosbul, right? We find this in a part of the Talmud called Gittin 36a, and it goes like this. The Mishnah taught that Hillel the Elder instituted a document that prevents the sabbatical year from abrogating an outstanding debt, prosbul. We learned in a Mishnah there, Shvi'it 10:30, if one writes a prosbul, the sabbatical year does not abrogate debt. This is one of the matters that Hillel the Elder instituted because he saw the people of the nation were refraining from lending to one another around the time of the sabbatical year, as they were concerned that the debtor would not repay the loan, and they violated that which is written in the Torah. Beware that there not be a base thought in your heart, saying, the seventh year, the year of release, is at hand, and your eye be evil against your needy brother, and you give him nothing. This is from Deuteronomy 15:9. He arose and instituted the prosbul so that it would also be possible to collect the debts in order to ensure that the people would continue to give loans. So that's huge. That really takes someone to be in tune with God's spirit to actually understand what the Torah wants here. So this enactment of Hillel was for the benefit of the poor. And earlier we spoke about the rabbis working with the idea that you cannot make halakha that the population cannot uphold. So this is something we've spoken about in a later podcast, that you can't decree something that the people won't uphold, because then it will become a crushing burden. And we know Yeshua is talking about those extremists when he says, my burden is easy and my burden is light, and accuses them of crushing them and not lifting a finger to help them with that halakha. So in this way, the rabbis took into account the lowest members of their communities, not the rich or most powerful. So this enactment was supposed to stop the rich from withholding their hands from the poor. However, to do this, Hillel had to make a choice in how to create this enactment. He was guided by the spirit of love for your fellow as yourself, or love your neighbor. Hillel had to override one part of scripture with another to create this enactment. In the New Testament, we often see Yeshua interpreting one verse in the Torah in place of another to bring new insights or emphasis upon the spirit of the Torah. Yet he's saying he's not come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. Hillel's doing very much the same thing here. So let's break down what Hillel's doing. So he's taking Deuteronomy 15, 1-7. It says this: at the end of every seventh year, you must cancel the debts of everyone who owes you money. This is how it must be done. Everyone must cancel the loans they have made to their fellow Israelite. They must not demand payment from their neighbors or relatives, for the Lord's time of release has arrived. This release from debt, however, applies only to your fellow Israelites, not to the foreigners living among you. There should be no poor among you, for the Lord your God will greatly bless you in the land he is giving you as a special possession. You will receive this blessing if you are careful to obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am giving you today. The Lord your God will bless you as he has promised. You will lend money to many nations, but will never need to borrow. You will rule many nations, but they will not rule over you. But if there are any poor Israelites in your towns, when you arrive in the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards them. So that's the first part, right? That's Deuteronomy 15, 1-7. That's where Hillel is basing, where he's getting his source for his enactment that he's creating for people here, right? So he's taking that against Deuteronomy 15, 9-11. Do not be mean-spirited and refuse someone a loan, because the year of canceling debts is close at hand. If you refuse to make the loan and the needy person cries out to the Lord, you will be considered guilty of sin. Give generously to the poor, not begrudgingly, for the Lord your God will bless you in everything you do. There will always be someone in the land who are poor. That is why I am commanding you to share freely with the poor and with other Israelites in need. So Deuteronomy 15, 9, 11 and 15, 1 to 7 are being overriding at this moment Deuteronomy 15, 1 to 4. At the end of every seventh year, you must cancel the debts of everyone who owes you money. This is how it must be done. Everyone must cancel the loans that they have made to their fellow Israelites. They must not demand payment for their neighbors or relatives, for the Lord's time of release has arrived. This release from debt, however, applies only to your fellow Israelites, not to the foreigners living among you. So now we have the cancellation of one part of Torah in order to keep another part of the same Torah, to keep it alive, to make sure it safeguards people. So this is the whole interpretation. It's based on love for your neighbor as your fellow, as yourself, the love for the poor, the needy. And this is what drives the legal part of the Torah. It's the spirit. And James would agree that saying true religion is love for the poor, or upholding the cause of the poor, the widow, and the orphan. Right? So if the early rabbis used the love command or the spirit of the law to create halakha and follow a similar example to Yeshua, Yeshua is teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, the antithesis too. So if we've just seen that a whole part about, canceling debts and not begrudging in your heart to give to your fellow, if we've seen that we can emphasize one part of the Torah over the other to bring out the spirit, and that's done by the rabbis that wrote the Talmud and all the legal tradition, if they share the same ideas as Yeshua, then who is Yeshua actually in opposition with? Well, it would be these Purushim or separatists and extremists who did not believe there was any one command weightier or more important than another. The writers of the Dead Sea sect were known also as the Essenes. They seem to fit the description of one such group. For them, love your neighbor appears in a list of other commands, and it acts like any other commandment, just like keep the Sabbath day holy. In fact, they changed that verse in their interpretation to say love your brother and to love the sons of light and disapprove of the sons of darkness. And this kind of goes into how that they saw themselves as the true Israel and everyone else was led astray by these more lenient interpretations. So Yeshua is interpreting his antithesis in objection to those who would teach to hate your enemies or those outside of your closed-off brotherhood. For example, Matthew 5, 43, 48 is in the opposition, right, to this closed-off brotherhood. So love your fellow and hate your enemy. That's the kind of doctrine they're teaching in this Dead Sea sect. So in something called the Manual of Discipline, it says this, that they may love all the sons of light and hate all the sons of darkness. So the sectarians called themselves brothers or neighbors. This wasn't actually talking to the people amongst who you actually live. So Yeshua goes on to say that even tax collectors who love and who are able to reform themselves, that they are the greatest people, that they can become holy, right? It's the complete opposite of what these other guys are saying. Yeshua goes on to say that even tax collectors have this sort of love, and they are considered to be immoral, right? So he's equating this sectarian group with tax collectors, with people who represent the government and corruption. So Yeshua is saying that this idea is against the Torah, right? Look at what Proverbs has to say. Proverbs 25, 21 to 22. If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. For you'll heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. And then Proverbs 24, 17 to 20. Do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and do not let your heart be glad when he stumbles. Or the Lord will see it and be displeased, and turn his anger away from him. Do not fret because of evildoers, or be envious of the wicked. So even tax collectors and Gentiles can have the kinds of love for their friends and brothers, but the Torah is calling us to love our enemies. So in this, Yeshua is ruling that the greatest command upon which all the Torah hangs is the love of your enemies. This is how the love command can be the foundational text of halakha, or Jewish law, and how the rabbis believe the whole Torah and the prophets hangs upon it.